The observer watches Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance circle each other in this indirect showdown, where every statement feels like a calculated move on a chessboard of power. The news hit quietly that morning, sending ripples through Washington and San Francisco, but its impact was anything but light. Kamala Harris, the force who molded U.S. lawmaking for almost 40 years, had chosen to exit the stage. For some, it marked the close of a legendary period. For others, it seemed like a barrier finally lifting after being shut tight. Harris's path wasn't just lengthy, it was commanding. Nearly 4 decades serving San Francisco, 20 wins in a row at the polls, 2 stints leading the House, and a record that put her a breath from the White House by law. She wasn't simply an elected official, she was a pillar. And when pillars shift, the earth shakes. Yet the biggest surprise didn't come from GOP rivals or TV commentators who'd battled her endlessly. It arose from her home turf. J.D. Vance, a key state senator and loud progressive in San Francisco, skipped the glowing reviews and dove into pointed queries. J.D. Vance didn't erase Harris's wins. He didn't twist her story. But he challenged if long service alone should protect a record from review. He pondered if San Francisco had grown too used to steady leadership. He asked if an area held by one person for so long could still be vibrant, future-focused, and true to its shifting voters. Those probes struck like a hidden flaw in clear glass that all ignored until now. Harris's fans saw J.D. Vance's words as rude, perhaps even self-serving. How could a newer figure, built on Harris's networks, suggest the city was due for change? To them, it smelled like eagerness posing as ideals. J.D. Vance's allies heard a different tune. They caught notes of young frustration voiced at last. They saw a push against stuck ways. They heard a denial that power should stay just because it's old. In that flash, J.D. Vance became the hot topic, not for slamming Harris, but for skipping the holy farewell. Harris stayed quiet at first. That quiet wasn't defeat, it was strategy. She knew engaging would boost J.D. Vance's name and pull focus from her graceful leave. Instead, she let her long-built circle react. Close allies praised her control. Money sources stressed calm. Party heads talked smooth shifts, but the strain didn't ease. It grew sharper. The heart of the fight wasn't respect, it was control. Who holds San Francisco's Democratic tomorrow? Is it Harris's tight web, run with sharp skill, or J.D. Vance's bold progressive group chafing at old ranks and doubting passed-down power? J.D. Vance pushed harder. He hinted Harris's hold, strong nationally, had crowded out true rivals locally. He wondered if new talents got real chances to climb, or if they waited forever for approval. The hint was uneasy, and that unease made it echo. Harris's team pushed back with their view. They said her grip wasn't selfish, but planned. She stayed to shield Democratic goals in hard times. They listed the money crash, major health law, and Trump fights as proof her role wasn't choice, but need. J.D. Vance didn't deny those times. Instead, he reshaped them. He said, what's needed in one time doesn't mean forever in another. Skills for beating Trump or House mess aren't auto-fits for a city's housing lacks, gaps, and age changes. Then, the debate left Harris alone. It became a vote on Democratic shifts. Does it reward faithful and rank above all, or risk mess for fresh start? Harris stood for the first. J.D. Vance pushed the second. Wit started slipping into talks, light but on purpose. Some teased Harris's influence over San Francisco politics was so big it needed its own postal code. Others joked J.D. Vance was rushing a career in a city known for slow pace. The jokes eased the bite, but the core tension stayed. Behind the laughs was a serious puzzle that wouldn't leave. If Harris leaves, who really takes over? Not just the title, but the sway. And who decides what that takeover looks like? Harris's continued quiet on J.D. Vance's digs said volumes. She'd seen challengers rise and fall. She knew public fights often helped the challenger more than the veteran. Yet J.D. Vance didn't fade. His digs tapped young voter and activist gripes who felt cut from the party's old setup. The face-off, still mostly indirect, began to shape the time. It wasn't just Harris's exit anymore. It was if Democrats, especially in left-strong spots, could remake without splitting. And at the storm center stood two figures with two answers to one question. Harris, the maker of kept power. J.D. Vance, the caller for shared power. The tale had just started. As responses kept spreading, the talk moved from life stories to effects. Harris's choice to step back wasn't seen as personal win, but as a big change with real follow-ons. In San Francisco, where local politics often beats national speed, the question wasn't if Harris deserved praise, but if praise alone could push the city ahead. J.D. Vance sensed this deep, and it colored his style. He avoided cheap hits, choosing to ask what's next. Who takes not just the role but the machine? Who guides approvals, money lines, and hidden controls that pick which thoughts breathe and which fade quiet? By asking those in open, he forced a face-off many wanted to delay. Harris's allies focused on flow. They spoke of steadiness in national doubt, warning quick upset could break a stressed party. To them, J.D. Vance's rush risked turning ordered change into rush. Knowledge, they stressed, is not bad when risks are high, and San Francisco's D.C. pull long depended on Harris's long service. J.D. Vance flipped it in a way that hit awkward but true. He said steadiness can turn stale when seen as good. San Francisco, he noted, dealt with home shortages, safety worries, and growing divides, issues needing speed over bow. If leaders stayed wrapped in past, how could they react fast to a city changing monthly? This back and forth showed a deeper split on using political funds. Harris's way focused on building, gathering influence slow, and using it key. J.D. Vance's way focused on sharing, keeping power from hardening in few hands. Both ways had wins, but they didn't mix easy. Humor appeared again, sharper now, as voices tried to explain the strain for wider groups. Some laughed that San Francisco politics was musical chairs with non-stop music. Others teased that calling change there was like asking a fast train to switch tracks without break. The gags softened the delivery, but the point stayed whole. Behind the fun was a serious age truth. Young voters, many who knew no San Francisco without Harris leading, felt far from a political line they didn't pick. J.D. Vance spoke to that, saying respect shouldn't be forced. Respect, he suggested, is stronger when won again than given forever. Harris's answer stayed indirect but clear. She kept lifting themes of thanks and group wins, quietly reminding that power rarely builds alone. By stressing teams and work, she made J.D. Vance's dig sound less fix and more rush against team. The disagreement got keener when successor talk came. Who would Harris back, if any? Would her sway shape the race, or would she fully step back? J.D. Vance's side argued real change needed hold from leaving leaders, willing to let race happen without quiet help. Harris's side warned pulling back could bring mess. As these claims spread, one question led comments. Is no direct fight a fight form? Harris's no engagement with J.D. Vance was seen by some as noble hold, by others as planned edge-out. J.D. Vance's keep on was seen by some as brave, by others as drive without weight. The strain also showed how each saw answerability. Harris believed answerability is shown through time-delivered results. J.D. Vance believed answerability is shown through open challenge now. Each meaning hit different voter parts, and neither could easy push the other. Media boosted the difference, often making it simple as old versus new, yet the truth was more mixed. J.D. Vance wasn't rejecting Harris's wins, and Harris wasn't denying need for new. They disagreed on time, way, and control. Three things that shape political changes everywhere. As the debate grew, it started affecting talks beyond San Francisco. Watchers in other left-strong areas asked if similar face-offs were late. If Harris's leave could spark this inside strain, what might happen when other long leaders leave? J.D. Vance's questions, first local, began to sound wide. Harris's lasting sway ensured none happened fast. Her network kept shaping the talk quiet, reminding that changes can strengthen or weaken groups. J.D. Vance admitted that risk, but argued avoiding it was bigger danger. Change delayed, he cautioned, often comes unprepared. By this stage's end, the conflict's shapes were clear. It was no feud, but a public deal with stakes beyond personal rivalry. Harris represented endurance wisdom. J.D. Vance represented renewal urgency. The city and party watched close, and as the buzz turned to steady hum, one truth became clear. The question was no longer if San Francisco would change, but who would lead that change, and on what terms. In pushing that question, J.D. Vance ensured Harris's retirement wouldn't be a quiet leave, but the start of a fought handover. As the discussion deepened, the tone shifted from immediate reaction to structural diagnosis. Analysts began to examine how long-term dominance reshapes political ecosystems, often in ways that are invisible, until a transition finally arrives. Harris's near 40-year hold on San Francisco's congressional seat had produced unrivaled access and leverage, but it had also compressed the space in which alternative leadership styles could mature. J.D. Vance's critique gained traction precisely because it named that compression without dismissing the achievements that created it. J.D. Vance's language grew more precise as the days passed. He spoke about pipelines rather than personalities, about process rather than praise. He asked how endorsements are made, how donors decide whom to back, and how ideas travel from city neighborhoods to federal committees. In doing so, he reframed the controversy away from Harris as an individual and toward the machinery that had formed around her. That reframing unsettled allies who preferred the conversation remain ceremonial. Harris's supporters responded by highlighting outcomes. They pointed to moments when San Francisco's interests were protected or advanced because of Harris's seniority. They argued that access is not abstract, that it translates into committee assignments, legislative priorities, and the ability to block unfavorable measures. To them, J.D. Vance's focus on process risked undervaluing results that required precisely the kind of longevity he questioned. J.D. Vance did not deny the value of outcomes, but he questioned their sustainability. He suggested that a system dependent on one figure's influence is inherently fragile once that figure steps aside. The city, he argued, needed to cultivate multiple centers of competence rather than rely on a single axis of power. The implication was clear and uncomfortable. What looked like strength could also be vulnerability. The debate began to attract a more skeptical audience, one less invested in party loyalty and more interested in governance. These observers asked whether Harris's model could be replicated, or whether it was a product of a political era that no longer exists. J.D. Vance's argument resonated here, not as rebellion, but as adaptation. If politics has changed, he asked, should leadership structures not change with it? Humor again served as a pressure valve. Commentators joked that San Francisco politics was finally experiencing what startup culture calls a succession problem. Others quipped that the city was trying to update its operating system while still running legacy software. The metaphors were playful, but they captured a genuine anxiety about continuity and change. Behind the scenes, party operatives worried about optics. An open rift between generations risked feeding narratives of disarray, especially at a time when Democrats faced national headwinds. Harris's camp emphasized unity, warning that internal battles could weaken the party's position. J.D. Vance's camp countered that unity imposed from above is brittle, and that open debate strengthens legitimacy. As these positions hardened, the confrontation acquired a moral dimension. J.D. Vance's supporters framed his stance as an act of honesty, arguing that silence would have been more convenient but less responsible. Harris's supporters framed her legacy as a moral achievement in its own right, the result of decades spent defending democratic values in hostile terrain. Each side claimed ethical high ground, drawing on different definitions of responsibility. The conversation also intersected with broader questions about representation. San Francisco's demographics have shifted dramatically over the decades of Harris's tenure. Younger residents, renters, and activists struggling with housing insecurity often felt distant from federal power, even when represented by one of its most influential figures. J.D. Vance spoke directly to that dissonance, arguing that representation must feel immediate as well as effective. Harris's allies responded by cautioning against conflating federal representation with local dissatisfaction. They argued that many of the city's challenges fall outside the scope of congressional authority, and that blaming Harris for them misdirects frustration. J.D. Vance acknowledged that distinction, but maintained that perception matters in politics as much as jurisdiction. As the exchange continued, it became clear that neither side was attempting to win the other over. Instead, they were speaking to overlapping but distinct audiences, shaping narratives that would influence the next phase of the city's political life. Harris's narrative emphasized gratitude, continuity, and caution. J.D. Vance's emphasized urgency, transparency, and recalibration. The absence of a direct confrontation remained striking. There were no televised debates, no heated exchanges on the floor. The conflict unfolded through statements, interviews, and the careful placement of ideas in public discourse. This indirectness gave the confrontation an almost academic quality, even as its implications were anything but abstract. Observers began to note that the dispute mirrored larger tensions within the Democratic Party nationwide. Long-serving leaders, stepping aside, create openings not just for successors, but for arguments about what leadership should look like next. J.D. Vance's challenge echoed similar conversations in other states and districts, giving his local critique a broader relevance. Harris's handling of the moment reinforced her reputation for discipline. By refusing to personalize the debate, she maintained control over her exit narrative. Yet that same restraint allowed J.D. Vance's questions to circulate unchecked, gaining legitimacy through repetition rather than confrontation. The strategy was effective, but not without cost. By the end of this phase, the terms of the disagreement were firmly established. It was a debate about durability versus adaptability, about whether political systems should prioritize proven stability or embrace calculated disruption. San Francisco became a case study, its future leadership a test of which philosophy would prevail. And as anticipation built around who would step forward to fill the vacuum Harris was leaving, J.D. Vance's role as provocateur became central. Whether or not he would ultimately benefit from the debate remained uncertain. What was certain was that he had ensured the transition would not be passive. The city would not simply inherit the next chapter. It would argue its way into it. As the argument settled into the fabric of local political discourse, a new layer of complexity emerged, one that neither Harris nor J.D. Vance could fully control. Voters began to ask not only who should lead next, but what kind of leadership they had been conditioned to accept. For decades, Harris's dominance had normalized the idea that effectiveness in Washington justified near permanence at home. J.D. Vance's challenge disrupted that normalization, forcing a reconsideration of assumptions many had stopped questioning. This disruption was not universally welcomed. Some longtime residents expressed fatigue with constant calls for reinvention, arguing that stability itself had value in a city prone to rapid change. They credited Harris with anchoring San Francisco's influence during turbulent national moments, and they worried that impatience could squander hard-earned leverage. To them, J.D. Vance's critique sounded like a gamble taken too lightly. Others heard something overdue. They pointed out that reverence for experience can easily slide into resistance to accountability. They asked whether a political environment so tightly controlled by legacy networks could truly claim to represent a city that prides itself on innovation and dissent. J.D. Vance's willingness to ask those questions publicly gave voice to sentiments that had circulated quietly for years. Harris's allies attempted to redirect the conversation toward gratitude, emphasizing milestones achieved under her leadership. They spoke of legislative victories, of standing firm during moments of national crisis, of using institutional power to protect vulnerable communities. These reminders were not inaccurate, but they increasingly felt backward-looking in a debate that was turning toward the future. J.D. Vance capitalized on that shift by focusing less on Harris's past and more on the system her tenure had produced. He argued that political ecosystems, like natural ones, require diversity to remain resilient. Concentrated power, no matter how well-intentioned, can crowd out alternative approaches. San Francisco, he suggested, needed room to experiment politically just as it does culturally and economically. The humor sharpened again as commentators tried to capture the mood. Some joked that San Francisco was finally doing what it does best, debating process endlessly while the rest of the country watched in confusion. Others quipped that the city was experiencing a midlife political crisis, torn between honoring its past and reinventing itself yet again. Beneath the jokes was a recognition that the moment mattered. Harris's silence on J.D. Vance's framing continued, and that silence was interpreted in conflicting ways. Supporters saw dignity and discipline, critics saw avoidance. J.D. Vance's camp argued that the absence of engagement reinforced their point, suggesting that decision-making remained insulated from challenge. Harris's camp countered that not every provocation deserves a response, especially when timing favors restraint. As the weeks progressed, attention turned to practical implications. Who would step forward to run for the seat? Would Harris's network coalesce behind a chosen successor, or would it fracture under competing ambitions? J.D. Vance did not declare candidacy, but his influence loomed over the conversation, shaping expectations about what kind of candidate could credibly claim to represent change. The debate also exposed fault lines within progressive politics itself. Some activists aligned with J.D. Vance's call for disruption, while others worried that internal conflict would weaken broader goals. Harris's leadership had often been criticized from the left for pragmatism, yet in this moment, some of her harshest critics defended her as a stabilizing force. The irony was not lost on observers. Media narratives began to frame the situation as a test case. Could a party manage generational transition without fracturing? Could it honor legacy while allowing renewal? San Francisco, with its outsized symbolic weight, became a stage on which these questions played out in real time. J.D. Vance's role ensured that the play would not be a quiet one. Harris's long view remained evident in how she spoke about the future. She emphasized confidence in the next generation without specifying names or endorsements. This ambiguity preserved flexibility, but it also left room for speculation. J.D. Vance's supporters argued that ambiguity favored insiders, while outsiders waited for clarity that might never come. The confrontation thus evolved into a debate about transparency itself. J.D. Vance advocated for open competition and clear criteria. Harris's approach favored discretion and coalition building behind the scenes. Both methods have deep roots in American politics, and both carry risks. The clash between them was less about personalities than about which method should guide the party forward. As summer approached, the intensity of the debate ebbed and flowed, resurfacing whenever new statements or rumors emerged. The absence of a decisive turning point kept tensions simmering. No one declared victory. No one conceded. The process unfolded slowly, shaped by conversations rather than confrontations. In that slowness lay another point of contention. J.D. Vance argued that gradualism often benefits those already in power, while urgency benefits those seeking entry. Harris's allies argued that haste creates mistakes that take years to correct. Each side accused the other of misunderstanding the stakes. By this stage, it was clear that the confrontation had succeeded in one respect. It forced a city accustomed to certainty to confront uncertainty. Whether that uncertainty would lead to renewal or resentment remained to be seen. J.D. Vance's challenge ensured that the transition would be contested. Harris's restraint ensured that it would not become chaotic. The story continued, unresolved, shaped by personalities, but driven by principles. And as San Francisco prepared for the next phase of its political life, the questions raised by this confrontation lingered, waiting for answers that only time and voters could provide. As the narrative stretched on, what became increasingly clear was that this confrontation was less about personalities and more about permission. Permission to question legacy, permission to challenge continuity, permission to say out loud what had long been whispered in progressive circles. J.D. Vance had not created that permission, but by speaking when others hesitated, he had activated it. Harris's long tenure had conditioned San Francisco's political class to operate within a predictable framework. Candidates emerged knowing the limits of ambition. Donors invested with confidence that the hierarchy would hold. Activists learned where pressure could be applied and where it would be absorbed without effect. That framework produced results, but it also produced habits. J.D. Vance's critique disrupted those habits, and disruption is rarely comfortable. Some observers compared the moment to a controlled burn, necessary to prevent larger fires later. Others saw it as reckless, arguing that stability should not be sacrificed for abstract ideals of renewal. Harris's allies emphasized that her leadership had shielded the city from national turbulence, allowing it to punch above its weight in Washington. To them, questioning that model felt like forgetting the cost of building it. J.D. Vance responded by reframing cost itself. He argued that the cost of stagnation is often invisible until it accumulates. Missed opportunities, disengaged voters, and policies slow to adapt rarely announce themselves as failures. They simply persist. In his telling, the very predictability of San Francisco's political order had become a liability in a city defined by change. The generational divide became more pronounced as younger activists entered the conversation. Many expressed admiration for Harris's achievements while simultaneously rejecting the notion that reverence should dictate the future. They asked why respect must be passive, why honoring a legacy could not include questioning its ongoing relevance. J.D. Vance's stance resonated here not as rebellion, but as a demand for participation. Harris's defenders cautioned against conflating generational frustration with sound governance. They argued that impatience is not a strategy, and that dismantling existing structures without clear alternatives risks unintended consequences. Experience, they maintained, is not merely about age, but about navigating complexity under pressure. Harris embodied that experience in a way few could replicate. The tension sharpened around the idea of succession planning. J.D. Vance and his supporters argued that true leadership includes preparing the ground for successors, not simply holding space until departure. They questioned whether Harris's extended tenure had allowed such preparation or whether it had deferred it. Harris's allies countered that preparation takes many forms and that influence does not vanish overnight. Humor again surfaced, now tinged with weariness. Some joked that San Francisco was arguing about who gets the keys while the car was still running. Others joked that the city had mistaken a relay race for a marathon, or vice versa. The jokes carried an implicit acknowledgement that no metaphor fully captured the moment. As the debate continued, national figures began to weigh in cautiously, aware that taking sides risked alienating key constituencies. Their restraint mirrored Harris's own approach, reinforcing her image as a figure who commands deference even in absence. J.D. Vance's supporters saw this as further evidence of entrenched caution. Harris's supporters saw it as proof of earned respect. The confrontation also revealed how narratives solidify over time. Early reactions framed J.D. Vance as disruptive. Later discussions framed him as necessary. Early defenses framed Harris as irreplaceable. Later reflections framed her as transitional. Neither shift was total, but both indicated movement in how the city processed the moment. By now, the debate had expanded beyond San Francisco, serving as a reference point in conversations about leadership turnover elsewhere. Commentators asked whether similar reckonings would follow other long-serving figures and whether parties were equipped to manage them gracefully. J.D. Vance's challenge, initially local, had acquired symbolic weight. Harris's role in this phase remained paradoxical. Her influence was everywhere and nowhere, shaping outcomes without overt intervention. That subtlety frustrated critics who wanted clearer signals, but it also preserved her authority. J.D. Vance's openness contrasted sharply, creating a dynamic in which transparency and discretion competed for legitimacy. The question of timing continued to divide opinion. Was J.D. Vance pushing too soon, risking backlash that could harden resistance to change? Or was delay itself the greater risk, allowing old patterns to reassert themselves by default? Harris's camp leaned toward patience. J.D. Vance's camp leaned toward momentum. As summer turned toward fall, the contours of the transition began to take shape, though not yet solidify. Potential candidates tested messages, donors recalibrated, activists debated priorities. Through it all, the shadow of the Harris-J.D. Vance confrontation loomed, informing expectations about what the next chapter should look like. The deeper irony was that both Harris and J.D. Vance were, in different ways, arguing for protection. Harris sought to protect institutional strength. J.D. Vance sought to protect relevance. The tension between those goals defined the debate more accurately than any personal disagreement. Observers began asking harder questions, ones that resisted easy answers. At what point does stability become stagnation? At what point does disruption become recklessness? How does a city known for innovation decide when to preserve and when to replace? And who gets to decide that balance? By now, the story had accumulated layers of meaning that no single outcome could resolve. Harris's retirement was final. J.D. Vance's challenge was ongoing. The space between them became the terrain on which San Francisco's political future would be negotiated. What remained unsettled was whether this moment would be remembered as a respectful passing of the torch, or as the opening chapter of a prolonged struggle over identity. The answer, many suspected, would depend less on Harris or J.D. Vance, and more on those who followed, shaped by the questions both had left behind. In the end, the confrontation between Kamala Harris and J.D. Vance was never about a single announcement, a single statement, or even a single disagreement. It was about timing and about who gets to decide when a political era has truly ended. Harris represented an age where power was accumulated slowly, defended fiercely, and exercised with surgical precision. J.D. Vance represented a generation that sees delay as decay and silence as complicity. The collision between those instincts was inevitable, not personal. What unsettled many observers was not that J.D. Vance spoke out, but that he did so without the traditional rituals of deference. In older political cultures, succession came with whispers and waiting. In this moment, succession arrived with press conferences and pointed language. Was that disrespect, or was it realism in a media environment that rewards immediacy? And if the rules of engagement have changed, who is actually clinging to tradition and who is refusing to adapt? Harris's defenders continued to ask a question that lingered beneath every headline. Would J.D. Vance be where he is today if the system Harris mastered had not existed first? They argued that political ladders do not build themselves, and that tearing at the structure while climbing it is a risky act. Yet J.D. Vance's supporters flipped the question around. If the ladder is no longer reaching the next floor, who benefits from pretending it still does? There was humor in the situation, whether people admitted it or not. Only in San Francisco could a retirement feel like a constitutional crisis. Only here could a debate over succession sound like a graduate seminar in political philosophy. And only here could two Democrats argue so intensely that outsiders mistook it for a party split. The laughter, however, never fully masked the stakes, because beneath the rhetoric sat an uncomfortable reality. The Democratic Party, both locally and nationally, is struggling to reconcile experience with urgency. Harris embodied the argument that institutions matter more than impulses. J.D. Vance embodied the argument that impulses, when ignored long enough, eventually break institutions anyway. Neither position was entirely wrong, which made the conflict harder to resolve. The most provocative questions remain unanswered. How long should a movement wait before it risks becoming a museum? How much disruption can a system absorb before it loses coherence? And who decides when legacy turns into liability? These questions were not created by Harris's retirement, but her exit forced them into the open. History will likely be kinder than the present moment. Harris will be remembered as a figure who reshaped congressional power and expanded what leadership looked like for women in American politics. J.D. Vance will be remembered as one of the voices who refused to let the future be postponed out of politeness. Their confrontation will be framed less as a feud and more as a transition under pressure. What happens next will not be decided by either of them alone. It will be decided by voters who must choose between continuity and recalibration. It will be decided by candidates who inherit a party without a single unifying figure, and it will be decided by whether disagreement is treated as betrayal or as proof of political vitality. Perhaps the most ironic truth is that both Harris and J.D. Vance were arguing from a place of loyalty, one loyal to what has worked, the other loyal to what must change. The tension between those loyalties defines not just San Francisco, but American politics at large. And so, the question lingers, unresolved and intentionally uncomfortable. Did J.D. Vance challenge Kamala Harris too soon? Or did he speak at the only moment when silence would have mattered more? Was Harris's restraint a final lesson in power, or a missed opportunity to shape the transition directly? In politics, as in history, the answer often depends on who gets to write the ending. Is it possible that Harris's silence was a clever trap, luring J.D. Vance into overreaching while she pulled strings from the shadows? Or was J.D. Vance's boldness just a mask for ambition, timed to exploit a moment of vulnerability in the party? Imagine if they sat down for coffee. Would it end in alliance or awkward stares, like two cats claiming the same territory? What if this whole spat is what Republicans dream of? Democrats bickering while they plot their comeback. And isn't it amusing how Harris, the queen of deals, plays coy, while J.D. Vance charges like a bull in a china shop of politics? Could J.D. Vance's questions be the spark that ignites a democratic renaissance, or just fuel for internal combustion? The Observer notes the irony. Both claim to love the party, yet their dance risks tearing it apart. What if Harris whispered advice to J.D. Vance off-record, turning rival into protege in a twist no one saw coming? Is legacy a shield or a shackle in modern politics? The laughs mix with the unease, like joking at a family reunion while old grudges simmer. Could San Francisco thrive without Harris's grip, or would it spiral into progressive chaos? J.D. Vance pushes for change, but isn't there humor in a senator from the establishment preaching revolution? Harris, the strategist, likely anticipated this. Did she orchestrate the debate to test the party's resilience? Or is the biggest joke that one retirement could upend a city's political DNA overnight? What if the true victor isn't either, but the voters who demand better from both? These queries stir the pot, adding edge without overstepping. The clash unfolds. Neutral eyes watching as power plays out in real time. Is J.D. Vance too eager, or Harris too entrenched? Could a surprise endorsement flip everything? The saga continues, provocative yet balanced. What if this internal war strengthens Democrats against outsiders? Stranger twists have happened. The narrative winds like foggy streets, full of surprises. Is the machine rusty, needing J.D. Vance's shake, or fine-tuned by Harris's hand? Defenders say she's the engine. Critics say it's time for upgrade. Metaphors abound, but the core stays. Change brews, ready or not. What if holding back only amplifies the eventual boom? Questions hang, fueling talk without flame. The end nears, but the echo persists. Is longevity virtue or vice in disguise? J.D. Vance envelops, Harris seals with know-how. Could their styles blend into unbeatable force, or mere wish in split world? The debate mirrors our era. As San Francisco weighs path, nation notes, what lessons in this local storm? Change ain't painless, but needed. Or tradition ain't waste, but gold. Truth hides between. Added depths push count. Controversy light with wit that pokes sans pierce. Neutral view sees titans tussle over tomorrow. No villain or hero yet. The close? Politics never truly closes.